Hello, and thanks for tuning in. Today, we're going to be taking a look at another video from Prager discussing a very specific kind of morality.
There are almost no issues where I don't understand both sides.
That appears to be patently false by the other videos you put out, but okay. Even I do not understand all sides to most arguments, though I probably understand both sides to a fair deal of them.
Taxation, the size of government, abortion, socialism, capitalism. As strongly as I feel about any issue, I understand the opposition.
Fair enough.
But there is an exception, the death penalty for murder.
That's odd, though, because the death penalty is one of the easiest arguments to understand both sides. It takes only one piece of information. Some people believe that murder is bad no matter the reason, and some people believe that sometimes it is justified. That's not a false dichotomy. Those are the only two options, and it's pretty easy to understand them, I think. This isn't a nuanced argument.
Here, the gulf is unbridgeable between those of us who believe that some murderers, and I emphasize some murderers, should be put to death, and those who believe that no murderer should ever be put to death.
See, you actually do already understand both sides of the argument. So you were a bit disingenuous, or perhaps what you meant to say was you don't understand how people can hold the opinion. Just saying. Semantics is very important when you're debating.
Take this example.
Don't tell me what to do. I'll take whatever I want. Provide an example. You don't need to be so offensive, Dennis. Just say, for example, or perhaps say, here's an example, or say, let's have a look at this illustration. Something like that. Just saying. Sometimes mixing it up a little bit gives it a little more flavor. Also, I really don't like old turns of phrases that are just there for the hell of it. Kinda like for the hell of it. We need better phrases.
On the afternoon of July 23, 2007, in the town of Cheshire, Connecticut, two men broke into the home of Dr. William Pettit, his wife Jennifer, and his two daughters.
Just a little bit of constructive criticism. You skipped over a word there in your text. Have your post guy maybe smooth it out a little bit next time, because it's much easier to read if you have more of the text on the screen at once. I realize it's a little less emotionally stirring when the words don't just pound in your face, but there is something to be said for nuance.
The men beat Dr. Pettit nearly to death with a baseball bat. One of the men raped the doctor's wife, and the other man sexually assaulted their 11-year-old daughter, Michaela.
You know, I think you and I are actually going to agree that the death penalty should be allowed for certain cases. However, for the sake of practicing argument, I'm going to take the devil's advocate here and show you how easy it is to understand the other side of the argument.
The two men then strangled Mrs. Pettit to death, tied down the two daughters on beds, doused them with gasoline, and while the girls were still alive, set the house on fire.
This is an argument from emotion, and here is an example of why it's a fallacy. Every year in America, people are sentenced to death and die because of wrongful convictions. You don't want innocent people to die, do you? See, that's why it's a logical fallacy. He's trying to play on the idea that you're going to feel bad that this thing happened and that someone should pay for it, regardless of whether it's the right person or not. Keep that in mind when someone tries to play on your emotions. That's not when you should make your arguments, because that person is not going to listen to you. They're going to listen to how their gut feels.
Dr. Pettit survived, but his wife and daughters did not. Those opposed to capital punishment believe that these two men have a right to keep their lives.
You see, though, that's not exactly correct. A lot of times when people oppose the death penalty, they don't do so because they believe that the murderer should not be taken out of society, but they believe that murder minimizes the value of human life, and that people should not be killed, even if they have committed atrocities. They don't necessarily believe that violent criminals deserve to live, but they often believe that killing them would trivialize the crime that they committed. Again, I realize this is more nuanced than you normally get in a video, but I think you're creating a straw man, and not a particularly useful one, because you'd rather argue from emotions than from the actual argument.
So, is there anything a person can do to deserve the death penalty?
But you see, I can slip that slope the other direction and ask, do you think there are crimes that should not be punished with death that involve any form of killing another person? Let's say, for example, your car malfunctions and you run someone over and kill them. You have killed someone because you are in operation of the car. Let's say it's even self-defense, and you happen to kill the person in question. Why shouldn't you face the death penalty if you have effectively committed the same crime as someone else who kills someone but gets the death penalty? Why should there ever be any exception for anyone committing any kind of murder, intentional or otherwise, from facing the death penalty? Remember, the slope slips both directions.
To those opposed to capital punishment, the answer is no. In fact, many opponents of capital punishment believe that killing murderers is the same as murder. You heard me right. Most opponents equate the murder of an innocent family with putting the murderers of that family to death.
And yes, I'm sure there are a few people who make that argument, exactly as there are some people who argue the point that I just made, that anyone who kills is a murderer and should be put to death, and the death penalty should even be used in cases where murder didn't happen. So again, if you're going to tell me they're wrong in the extreme case, then you've also got to tell me why it's wrong to kill any person who breaks a law. Anything criminal, at least. Civil could be handled differently, like theft or whatever. But any violent crime is a violent crime. Why should every violent crime, assault, battery, rape, murder, etc., why should they all not have the death penalty? Because some people would argue that they should. Again, I am for the death penalty in certain cases, but I'm arguing against it here just as a matter of showing that it's not that hard to understand.
Opponents of capital punishment also argue that keeping all murderers alive sanctifies the value of human life.
You know, for this one I'm actually going to reference the Bible. Because if you look at communities like the Amish, or some fundamentalist Christians, they believe that God is the giver and sanctifier of life, and that man should never take a life. Only God should decide these things. For example, to the extent that if an Amish man should happen to be killed by a drunk motorist, or as you had in the West Nichols Mine school shooting case, and so on, they do not believe in punishing those people with death. Because again, they believe all life, even the life of criminals, is sanctified by God, because it is human life, and we are all human. Again, I'm not saying I entirely agree with it, because clearly I don't. But some people actually do believe that the death penalty diminishes the value of life, for reasons that you would probably agree with, in a general context. Just throwing that out there. Again, I'm not saying I agree with it, I'm just saying it's easy to understand why people rationalize it.
But the opposite is true. Keeping every murderer alive cheapens human life because it belittles murder. That's easily proven. Imagine that the punishment for murder were the same as the punishment for driving over the speed limit.
Alright, we're gonna break this down into little chunks, so let's listen to each part and unpack it individually again here.
But the opposite is true. Keeping every murderer alive cheapens human life.
But the corollary is letting any murderer live cheapens the value of the punishment.
Because it belittles murder.
And again, the corollary is, if you do not apply the death penalty to every person who is in part or in full responsible for the death of someone, then you're belittling the life of every victim of murder whose murderer is not treated to the death penalty. Just saying, that is the corollary to your reasoning.
That's easily proven. Imagine that the punishment for murder were the same as the punishment for driving over the speed limit.
And again, the corollary is therefore very easy to prove. Imagine that the punishment for killing someone were not the same as the punishment for killing someone. For example, homicide versus manslaughter versus aggravated manslaughter versus negligent homicide. Shouldn't they all just be the death penalty? Or are you saying some victims are not worth the death penalty as a justification for the crime committed against them, of them now being dead?
Wouldn't that belittle murder and thereby cheapen human life?
And again, wouldn't sparing anyone from the death penalty belittle the life of the victim? You know, as much as I agreed with Dennis when I started this video, I think I'm actually starting to agree more with the arguments I'm making. Maybe I'm not as much for the death penalty as I thought I was at the beginning of this video. This is why it is important to question even your own opinions and try to work backwards from the opposite opinions. This is the essence of being a skeptic, is not only being able to question arguments you disagree with, but even being able to question the ones you do and form new opinions around them.
Of course it would. Society teaches how bad an action is by the punishment it metes out.
There are two different ways to respond to this. The first one is to point out that, according to the Bible, there are only two punishments. Either you go to hell for any sin, or you believe in Jesus and all of it is forgiven. So according to the Bible, all sin is basically the same, and is all punished basically the same. Secondly, I don't think that a punishment necessarily must be commensurate to the crime. But I do believe that if you're going to have a system where it is, then you don't have the luxury of saying that intent matters. Because if it's the crime that needs to be punished, then you remove the point of reform, which again is an argument against the death penalty. Not one that I necessarily agree with. I believe that some people cannot be reformed. But those are two arguments I can understand, even though I don't agree with them. Just throwing it out there.
And what about the pain inflicted on the loved ones of those murdered? For most people, their suffering is immeasurably increased.
And again, rape falls in that category. Domestic abuse, all manner of violence, theft can fall into that category of things that make you have immeasurable suffering. Arson, if someone burns down your favorite art that cannot be recovered. Again, I'm saying you're not making a good argument for why there should be a death penalty for these kinds of things. Unless you're saying that every crime should have the death penalty because every crime creates measurable or immeasurable suffering. Are you saying only crimes that cause immeasurable suffering should be punished with the death penalty? And also, how do you propose to measure the suffering of any given crime in a standardized fashion? I'm trying to work with you here. And I actually still agree with you that the death penalty should be there for certain cases. But you're making me do a very good job of disagreeing with you to the point where my opinion may not actually match yours at the end of the video.
Knowing that the person who murdered their family member or friend, and who in many cases inflicted unimaginable terror, is alive and being cared for.
Right. And again, if it only has to do with the level of suffering that those affected by the crime, who are not technically the victims, feel, you're opening up a very bizarre can of worms, where I can just claim that I am immeasurably affected by any given crime, and that the person who perpetrated it should be killed. Do you see the flaw in that reasoning? I'll give you time to think about it. Pause the video if you need.
Of course, putting the murderer to death doesn't bring back their loved one, but it sure does provide some sense of justice.
Retribution is not necessarily justice. An eye for an eye eventually just leaves everyone blind, because someone's got to take the eye of the guy whose job it is to take the eye of the person who took the eyes. You see, you're talking about an argument from equality versus from equity, and saying that justice and retribution are the same thing. Usually we frown upon vigilantism, but it's arguably what you're saying we should do. Whiskey for my men, beer for my horses, right?
That's why Dr. Pettit, a physician whose life is devoted to saving lives.
The value of a murder is not determined by the worth of the person who was killed, is it? You do realize that's what you're starting to argue with this argument from emotion, and that's a very dangerous place to go. And it's one of the fundamental arguments for why the death penalty should not be a thing. Again, think about it for a moment, Dennis, and see if you catch on before you make a very serious error.
Wants the murderers of his wife and daughters put to death. In his words, death is really the only true just punishment for certain heinous and depraved murders.
Did you catch that, though? There's a reason we have a system of checks and balances. Let me play the first part of that little clip again.
Wants the murderers of his wife and daughters put to death.
And I agree, that's probably the best course of action, but the reason for it, your justification for it, is wrong. It doesn't matter that he wants it, because I might want everyone who commits any crime ever to be removed from general society. But again, that doesn't mean it should be done. This is known as the fallacy, where you arrive at a conclusion, but for the wrong reason. You see, the best reason that there should be a death penalty is, again, that some people cannot be reformed. Like, this person goes out with the intent to do something terrible, and he should be treated as such, regardless of whether this man wants him killed, or if it happens to be the Amish, they do not want him to undergo the death penalty. You see, the individual wants should not be an argument, but the standard of law, at least the standards that are ethical, should be the only foundation for law, in my opinion, because feels is not an argument.
Is the doctor wrong? Is he immoral?
And again, is it wrong or immoral to say that you should forgive the sinner, but still punish the sin? Because even the Amish, if a crime is committed against them and they do not want to take action, the state may still prosecute it anyway, even if they genuinely do not want that. Are you saying that the victims of murder should not have a uniform punishment against the perpetrators? You're saying it should be left up entirely to how a third party feels about it? Because remember, you're not arguing that this fellow should be killed because the doctor was assaulted and survived. You're arguing that this fellow should be killed because he killed someone else and the doctor feels he should have the death penalty. You're not arguing that he should be given the death penalty because of his crime. You're arguing that he should be given the death penalty because of how someone who technically wasn't a victim of it wants that to be the punishment. Again, I agree that it's a heinous crime and it should be punished with the death penalty. But I do so for an entirely different reason from you. A reason that I feel is very important.
Well, if you think capital punishment is immoral, then Dr. Pettit is immoral.
Yes, that point would logically follow. But your premise is flawed because we build laws upon ethics, not upon morals. We have ethics committees and oversight hearings and that sort of thing. We do not have morals committees. We do not have morals boards. We do not base the value of a law on the morals that individuals have. We base law on the ethics of the community. Or to say it another way, we base our ethics on the fact that we are humans, and we are cognizant of this, and we hold ourselves accountable to one another for the actions against one another. And that doesn't require any morals to be involved, period.
And what about opponents' argument that an innocent person may be executed?
You know, that's an excellent argument to have, but this video's gone on long enough, and it's a different class of argument from any of the ones you've made so far. So maybe I'll go into it next time, but that's gonna be it for today. If you enjoyed that, click the thumbs up, share it, don't forget to subscribe. Leave me a comment down below and let me know what your thoughts are on morality, ethics, and the death penalty. Again, if you're feeling generous, I do have a Patreon. The link is down in the doobly-doo. If you want, you can follow me on VidMe. Unless you're watching this on VidMe, then go ahead and give it an upvote or click the follow down there, and that'll let you see more of these when I make them. And as always, this has been Reverend JR, signing off.